This reading is from If You're Lucky, Your Heart Will Break. Field notes from a Zen Life by James Ishmael Ford. As I experience it all, it seems we are all part of a great current, flowing from some unknown source to some unknown end, like a river on its way to an ocean. All we know with anything, even approaching certainty, is this moment itself. And we need to notice what we find here. This is where not knowing takes us, each following our own trajectory, each with our own moments, and all joined. For me, I found it sitting in a Buddhist monastery, eating a thin cabbage soup. For you, perhaps it's playing with a child. For another, perhaps listening to Mozart. Another, perhaps just noticing that it is possible in this moment only to not have a drink. For another, well, who knows? The secret is not knowing. Only don't know. Deep agnosticism. I suggest a deep agnosticism. Truly engaging not knowing is the universal solvent. It will release us from our hurts and fears by showing us, not in some abstract way, cognitive therapy sort of way, but in the deepest, most visceral way, who we really are. Open wide as the sky, and at that very same time, intimate, more intimate than any word can ever convey. And the way to wisdom is simple. Just don't know. Only don't know. That's all it takes.
It is what it is. When was it that phrase, "it is what it is," became our catch-all phrase in response to suffering? It seems to have seeped into our language like, or you know, and my favorite, yeah, no. Listen carefully to the next conversation you have with a friend experiencing loss, heartache, or some temporary trouble. Habitually, one of you will say at some point in the conversation, "It is what it is." This pseudo-philosophy we have collectively adopted signifies our willingness to get comfortable with the notion that objects have their own distinct nature. This circumstance is a fact distinct from what we think of it, where we think it will take us, distinct from how we think it will turn out. This can be productive when our minds want to rush ahead to the conclusion. It is what it is reminds us to stay here now, allowing the present to be what it is. In response to suffering, "it is what it is" can be sort of a there, pat on the arm on someone's, in the absence of something better to say. Yes, my suffering is what it is. And that isness, that distinct nature, is painful. Acknowledging it is what it is not an invitation to the denial of gut-wrenching feelings. It is an invitation to respond to life's tragic surprises with a willingness to fully inhabit this moment now. In If You're Lucky, Your Heart Will Break, the book by James Ishmael Ford, he writes, "As I experience it all, it seems we are all part of a great current flowing from some unknown source to some unknown end, like a river on its way to an ocean. All we know with anything even approaching certainty is this moment itself. And we need to notice what we find here. Reverend Ford is a Zen priest and a Unitarian Universalist minister. The two traditions complement each other, he reassures us. The one offering a method to explore what it is to be human, the other offering a reminder that reason and rationality always inform his exploration. Steeped in 40 years of Zen, guided by a rational liberal religious tradition, Reverend Ford recommends a deep agnosticism. Now, this deep agnosticism is not a response to the question about a belief in God or whether you believe in God or not, the sort of agnosticism that lives comfortably between theism and atheism. His recommended deep agnosticism is a response to all of life. When we are rushing ahead to the next moment, when we are sitting in the depths of despair, when we are desperately controlling the chaos of our lives, I suggest a deep agnosticism. Truly engaging not knowing is the universal solvent, he writes. It will release us from our hurt and fears by showing us not in some abstract cognitive therapy sort of way, but in the deepest, most visceral way, who we really are. Declaring it is what it is like saying, I don't know. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to say or to do. I don't know how this will turn out. When applied superficially, it is what it is can be a welcome buffer to our feelings. But when applied correctly, acknowledging what is calls us more deeply into our suffering and into more compassion for ourselves and all who suffer. Because all suffer. The Zen aphorism, here's another one. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. It's another one that we've adopted from the Zen tradition. It's a warning that suffering comes from our attachment to pain. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. It's another one of those phrases. It's wandered into our vocabulary on a superficial level from a way that is beyond words. This way beyond words, be it Zen or some other spiritual path, requires a practice. Reverend Ford breaks the Buddhist practice into 3 categories. 1, meditation. 2, non-dual insight. 3, how we live our lives. Now, for the Unitarian Universalist without a Zen practice, one might consider the categories this way. 1, taking time for reflection. 2, an experience of the transcendent. And 3, living from our 7 principles. The 3 phrases, it is what it is, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, and Ford's just don't know, only don't know. These phrases are best understood within the context of a spiritual practice that creates a lived experience. It is what it is. Experience directly, in the moment, now, what is. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. You are not your pain. It is not your fault. Just don't know, only don't know. Feel the wisdom. Experience it viscerally. Live these words beyond the surface of their meaning. Live these words from a way that is beyond words. Ministry continues to call me into a new relationship with suffering, a way of being that is beyond words, an acceptance of living from a deep agnosticism. I have learned from serving various congregations filled with the wisdom of many thoughtful souls, wrestling with the isness of their own suffering. Now, many of you know that I started my ministry as an intern minister at Horizon Unitarian Universalist Church in Carrollton, Texas. Now, what you may not know is that I visited Horizon for 4 weeks, about 2 years prior to my internship, because I had been one of those Unitarian Universalists who had gone to one church for about 10 years, and here I was about to be a minister, and it probably was time that I saw how other Unitarian Universalists do this thing that we call church, how they worship. And so I had a class that engaged me in that, a worship arts class. So I had an assignment to go to Horizon for 4 weeks. In the 4 weeks that I visited that congregation, they experienced a member's suicide. They also experienced the murder of the adult child of one of the member couples, their daughter, who was a victim of domestic violence. So much death, so much suffering in such a short period of time. And so one Sunday, before the service started, Reverend Hamilton stood up and announced the memorial service for their member who had committed suicide. And then, of course, during their joys and sorrows, he acknowledged that the loss was for the entire community, the entire congregation. Now, also during the sharing of joys and sorrows that day, and they stood and shared their joys and sorrows, an older man stood and shared on behalf of himself and his wife, invoking the memory of their adult child who had died 18 months before. He reflected on the difficulty of the passing of that time, and as he looked through the light-filled worship space, he said, "The light still comes through the windows." This is a light that poet and Unitarian Universalist Kathleen Sheeter Bonanno writes about when she writes about her daughter's murder in a collection of poetry entitled "Slamming Open the Door." This poem that we heard this morning, poem about light, comes from this collection. She writes, "You can try to strangle light, use your hands and think you've found the throat of it, but you haven't. You could use a rope or a garrote or a telephone cord, but the light, amorphous, implacable, will make a fool of you in the end." The unsettling effect of Bonanno's book is that you sit with her in her suffering. There is no looking away, no escaping the raw feelings. The poem about light is the final poem in this book, and even as the writer is finding hope, as light is finding its way in, there is a reminder of how Bonanno's daughter died, strangled with a telephone cord by a former boyfriend. Ironically, this last poem was the first poem written about her daughter's death, read as her victim's statement at the trial and at her daughter's memorial service. Who among us would say to a parent who has lost a child, "It is what it is"? Yet we say such awkward mush when people are suffering. We make the mistake of comparing our suffering to theirs. Either ours is worse or theirs is. Employing "it is what it is" accurately may mean that we remain silent when confronted with our neighbor's suffering. To have compassion, to suffer with, could be as simple as being with another person in the present moment of what is. To sit quietly, to listen deeply. These are the gifts of being with what is. Most of us cannot manage our own anxiety when confronted with the suffering of a loved one. We want to do something to alleviate their suffering, to fix them. We offer a solution demonstrating how much we know. Only don't know, Reverend Ford tells us. Sit in an intimacy that knows no boundaries. Sit in the present moment of what is, and your anxious self will drop away into the great current of endless creation. Afterwards, you can take action, make a casserole, bake a cake, write a card, all of which the good people of the Unitarian Society of Germantown, Pennsylvania, did for Kathleen Bonanno and her family. In response to her family's horrific tragedy, the congregation formed 7 committees immediately. There was a funeral to plan, there were family dogs to walk, there were meals to be made, there was a trial to attend. The whole congregation was grieving. They offered no platitudes about God's will, however. All they offered was the open-heartedness of a people used to facing life's hard questions with a deep agnosticism. In the poem, The Unitarian Society of Germantown, also in the book, Bonanno pays tribute to her church, describing it as a big wooden boat holding her with her husband as they are tossed about by rain in the dark. The reassuring words of the minister alone aren't enough to calm them. She writes, "One by one, the others press their bodies against us until finally we tire and lean in to their patient animal breath, to wait it out together." Now, in my assignment about the worship style of Horizon Unitarian Universalist Church, we were looking for a clue as to who this community was. It would be shown in the way they worship together. In the words of my Christian seminary, I was looking for how they demonstrated their piety. A nice Christian religious word, usually referring to how is it that people demonstrate their relationship to God. For Unitarian Universalists, that's so diverse. And how do we see that in the way that we come together and worship? Well, for them, their piety was demonstrated in the way their gathering took place. Very informal, very noisy, no quiet prelude for this community. Their piety was demonstrated in their deep sharing, in their willingness to laugh at themselves, in their surrender to the silence after prayer, and in the way they hold hands during the benediction. Now, I was also charged with discovering where the congregation most clearly shows the face of its soul, and that's a direct quote from the instructions from my professor. A good question to ask of any congregation, I think. How does the congregation show the face of its soul? So 2 years later, when I returned to Horizon, now as their ministerial intern, now standing behind a pulpit, now offering worship to them, I really began to discover how they showed the face of their soul. I listened to joys and sorrows, and then I answered back with a pastoral prayer. Some Sundays there was so much to pray for, I wondered how the small prayer I offered could hold back the darkness. One Sunday, there was so much cancer, and then another Sunday, I remember nothing was said. And like we do here, that Sunday, I prayed for all that was unspoken and that which remained in shadow. So of course it is in those moments that I discovered how they showed the face of their soul. It is the same as the Unitarian Society of German towns. It is the same as ours here. What does it look like, the face of a congregation's soul? Well, here's how I imagine it. I imagine it as a face tilted slightly upward towards the light. This is the stubborn sun, the poet writes, choosing to rise like it did yesterday, like it will tomorrow. You have nothing to do with it. The sun makes its own history. Light has its way. This is what is. The stubborn sun will choose to rise again and again. Rain falls on the just and unjust alike. Suffering happens, and when we acknowledge suffering for what it is, a thing, a circumstance, an event distinct in and of itself, we are set free. Here is what is in this moment now. You are sitting next to someone whose daughter or son or spouse is in recovery. You are sitting next to someone whose daughter or son or spouse just relapsed, or brother or sister or mother or father. You are shoulder to shoulder with someone whose sister died recently, or brother, or mother, or father. You are sitting with a cancer survivor. You are suffering with someone who lost their job. Your suffering is intimately connected to your neighbors. You are not alone. So as you go through this week, listen carefully for how you respond to your own suffering, your neighbors, or to the world's. Do you say it is what it is? If you do, are you proclaiming it as an act of denial or as an act of acceptance? If it is acceptance, is it an acceptance born of awareness that moves you toward action? There is no magic pill, no special ingredient, no mustard seed in the story of the Buddha. There is no magic pill that will save you from your suffering. There is only this moment now. Just this, only this, leaning in, breathing as one. What we find here in this moment now is each other. Just this. Only this. May it be so, and amen. And so an assignment for you this week, as you move forward into your week, take these words with you. It is what it is. See if you use them, or if others use those words in their conversation. How do you use them? Do you use them as a buffer, as a denial, or do you use them as acceptance? It is what it is. It connects us to each other. And now, if you'll please join me in the words to extinguish the chalice, which are found printed in your order of service.
We are the Caneo Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Our mission is to nurture spiritually courageous people who transform the world through justice and compassion. Like us on Facebook, check out our website at CVUUF.org, or come visit us. See you soon!